This is a production of Cornell University.
So this afternoon, I'm really happy to share some of the work we've been doing at the Urban Horticulture Institute. And what I'd like to do is set out the focus of our work and then discuss two areas of research. There's so many areas I'm focusing on two. So the science of greening our cities, there's a lot of science to the aesthetics you see in urban environments. So we're trying to talk about those issues. As you can see in the title slide, that tree ball is going to go into that little tree pit, and next time it sees anybody is when somebody will come and cut it down. So we talk a lot about ecosystem services provided by the urban landscape, and that's really true. And people like them, especially the people in the Forest Service and other folks, are talking about all the valuable ecosystem services provided by trees and soils. And we see, stormwater reduction, air and water quality improvement, energy conservation, carbon sequestration, all these great things, urban heat island mitigation, habitat, and more that we cannot quantify, but there are many different, basically, services that trees and soils provide. But although that's great, and I talk about it, and I believe that it's really important, my work really talks about the issues of getting to the point where you do have ecosystem benefits. So often trees do not thrive. They are really in a poor position. So we like to say, yes, we plant trees and we get all these benefits, but my work has really been dealing with getting the point to the trees are doing their best. And there are many challenges to the urban environment. As you can see here, a street in New York City, a tree is kind of holding on for dear life. And so over the years, I've come to look at our work as a process of landscape establishment, thinking that if you do things well at the beginning, then you have a chance for trees to actually thrive and provide us the ecosystem benefits for which we plant them. And it starts out with site assessment, understanding your site. I mean, urban environments are so heterogeneous that it's really not something you can just categorize in one way. So you really need to see the site conditions. And then once you understand your site, you can make proper plant selection. But in some cases, the site is so disturbed and so difficult that you have to modify the site in order for the plants to grow. So that plant selection, site modification goes back and forth. The better you make the site, the better the plant will grow and the more choice of plants you'll have. And then finally, the last part of establishment is transplanting, getting a tree into the ground and for the first few years before it becomes established. So our work really revolves around these 4 steps. And I think that, that's the way we're going to get the best result in the urban environment. So you don't have to be downtown New York City to have urban. In fact, you might recognize this place. This is the Ag Quad when Mann Library was being renovated. And for 3 years, there was a building site on the quad. And so the tremendous soil disturbance and root disturbance and all kinds of problems that went from that, and many trees were taken down. And so when all the trees and all the materials and the trailers were taken out and everything was back to normal, the tremendous soil disturbance that happened on that site, and that does not go away. Even if you put a couple of inches of soil on top and put some grass, the soil disturbance is pretty impressive. So site assessment really is understanding site opportunities and limitations. And we're looking at Connolly Park, downtown Ithaca, where housing development was built right next to it. And this was the staging area for that housing development. And when they basically finished the housing, they said to the city of Ithaca, well, you can have this and you can make a park on it. So said, okay, we did that. But we had to do many things to actually bring the soil back to health so that we could actually grow plants on it. It's growing very well now. Soil is a big issue of site assessment. We try to understand what's happening with the typical soil texture, structure, porosity, bulk density, but also we need to look at where the roots are in the urban environment. And so you can see one of the tools we use is called an air spade or an air excavation tool. And you can see these big Norway maples on the green strip between the curb and the sidewalk. And there's no way the tree roots of that tree would have enough volume in that, 6-foot wide green strip. So we wanted to find out where the roots are, and we do a lot of this work to understand where roots are growing in urban environments. In this case, we took off 4 inches of concrete, and we then tried to find where the roots are, because there's no way that there'd be enough soil volume in what you see on the surface. So so we actually did find that out, took the 4 inches of concrete off and found that the roots had actually found that area of weakness between the curb, between the sidewalk and the base course, and just made their way through that area into somebody's front yard, where they got a lot more of the soil volume that they needed. We see a lot of this very shallow rooting of trees in the urban environment because of the purposeful compaction we find in many cases. So a lot of what we're going to be thinking about is, how do we find enough volume for trees? And we'll also, how do you find the best trees to deal with this? Other issues that we deal with in the urban environment at the urban heat island. I don't know if you've seen our speaker last week, we talked about, we know about about climate change and rising temperatures, but in terms of the urban environment, we've had increased temperatures now for as long as there's been urban conditions, especially pavement and reflective heat and asphalt and cars. And so in the interior of our cities, we get a much raised temperature, which also puts a lot of stress on trees in terms of water loss and water access. I like this picture. It kind of shows what's going on here. So this is a picture taken with an infrared camera. And on the right, you can see that there's a scale from about 67 to 105 degrees. So we're showing the temperature of the surfaces of this area. And you can see those kind of columns in the back. Those are tree trunks, where the shade of those tree trunks, the grass there is about 67 degrees or so. If you come out from the shade, you're in the sun grass on a sunny site, and that gets up to 82 or so. And then when you come to that orange area, right at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that that's pavement. And if probably concrete, 105 degrees, but if you're in asphalt, maybe up as much as 135 degrees. So all these pavements and impervious surfaces reflect heat and basically raise the temperatures in our urban environment. So what we're really dealing with is looking at best tree selection and best site modification. So here we see on the top left, London plane tree showing its true genetic potential, giving all the basic resources that it needs. And that's me down at the bottom there. So it's an enormous tree. And then the same genetic material on the bottom right, also another London plane tree in the streets of New York City, showing that you can have all the best potential in the world if the environment does not allow you to get what you need. You'll have a much shortened life. So it's the nature and nurture issue that we deal with in terms of our research, choosing the best trees and trying to modify the site so that we have the best environment for our plants. So plant site selection criteria: pest-resistant plants adapted to site conditions, non-invasive, highly diverse, meets the design functional objectives, and matches management limitations. Now, from our point of view, many of those things are procedural and basically planning kinds of things we can do. But when it comes to plants adapted to site conditions, that's what we do most of our work on in terms of the plant selection aspect. So a lot of what we deal with is drought because of limited soil volumes, because of the hot nature of our urban environment. We have a lot of very high transpiration rates, low water availability, and even in a normal season, we would actually have water stress. So we started to look at plants that deal with water stress or limited water availability. And there are two basically strategies that trees use. One is avoid limited water deficits, and one is to tolerate water deficits. And avoidances may be increased water acquisition, deep rooting, increased hydraulic conductivity. And to reduce water uses, you have stomatal closure, leaf abscission, reduced stem and root growth, or stem and leaf growth. So those are avoidance mechanisms, and they're valid, but in terms of the urban environment, we want to have leaves on the trees, and so leaf abscission is not a really good strategy for us. In terms of tolerance, so we're very interested in looking at tolerance, those trees that can tolerate stress by an osmotic adjustment and having a very low turgor loss point. So these are things we're starting to look at, and we've done some work on this particular area. So yeah, in terms of deep rooting and having a lot more soil volume, that often is not possible because of the way we construct our urban environments. Parking lots, as you see here, the tree, there's only about 4 inches of soil in that area where the trees were growing. And it's amazing that it got that far, to grow that far before it actually went over. So deep rooting is not something we can often expect. Another avoidance aspect, though, it's kind of interesting. This is a great picture on the right. This is a Tilia tomentosa, or silver linden. And on the left, you see these amazing trichomes that are on the abaxial surface, basically covering up some of the stomata, so they're reducing water loss. And this is an avoidance strategy, which is because it doesn't cause the leaves to to upsize, and they still are functional. That's the tree on to the right. It's a really good strategy for dealing with water deficits. However, we don't have these on all trees, and even closing stomates also causes problems in terms of less photosynthesis and growth. So this idea of turgor loss point as a drought tolerator indicator is something we've been working on for many years. And it's kind of a universal measure. We can measure osmotic adjustment and calculate the turgor loss point, where trees actually can tolerate being in the droughty condition until they lose turgor and become damaged. And we can rank species in terms of their physiological drought tolerance this way. So this is some work a couple of my colleagues and I did a few years ago, where we took 27 maple species and cultivars, and we rated them for their turgor loss point. And the more negative you get, the better it is in terms of trees being able to tolerate stress in their cells before they lose turgor. And you can see at the bottom, we have the dark bars are spring turgor loss point, and the lighter bars are the summer calculations. And so you have at the top, let's say Acer spicatum, which has very, very low turgor loss point. And Acer spicatum is a tree you'll find in the gorges at Treeman and the understory, very, not very drought tolerant at all. And if you go down to the bottom, you see Acer montspecialenum, which is from a Mediterranean tree, and Acer grandidentatum, which is one from the arid western part of the US. And these have quite good abilities to modify their osmotic adjustment and have greater or more negative turgor loss points. So these would be more drought tolerant than the Acer spicatum, Acer manchuricum on the top. And so we can rate these. It's also interesting to note, if you're looking at the species, we have different cultivars, have different turgor loss points. So if you look at Acer sacrum toward the bottom, Green Mountain, which has pretty high turgor loss point, and then you go up to Acer sacrum caddo or Green Column, their turgor loss point is much different. So we have species cultivar differences that are very useful when we're choosing trees for the urban environment. So with this information, we started to look at evaluating a long-term project. This is white oak breeding project, which we started started the breeding in 2004, 2006, and we had 7 maternal parents and 36 pollen parents. We had 350 unique hybrids, which we were trying to develop more drought tolerance, more alkalinity soil tolerance, and as well as good disease and form and so on that would you need for the urban environment. We found some really unusual things here. We found true dwarfs. We found trees that had no central leader whatsoever, that grew laterally. And we had all kinds of different interesting things here, but we started to evaluate these for their ability to tolerate drought. And so this is not those hybrids, but this is showing, I was interested not only in measuring the drought tolerance with the turgor loss point, but also looking at, could we, by giving trees sequential dry downs, could we increase their turgor loss point, basically asking them to step it up, given a little bit of drought. So on these pictures, you'll see on the left is Quercus bicolor, swamp white oak. On the very far left, those trees were well watered. And then the one slightly to the right, those had gone through cyclical drought dry downs. And on the right side, you see Betula pendula, silver birch, on the far right that had been well watered. And the one toward the left of that had been going through cyclical dry downs. Now the birch is interesting. That's not considered a drought tolerant tree, and you can see why. Basically, when you give it cyclical dry downs, it just loses its leaves. It says, I've had it, I'm not going to deal with this. I'm basically going to drop my leaves and wait for better times. On the left with Quercus bicolor, it showed no leaf drop. It basically kept on photosynthesizing during this time, even though the one on the just to the right of the one on the left had gone through many cyclical dry downs. So this tree, this white oak, Quercus bicolor swamp white oak, is an exceptionally drought tolerant tree, and it has the added advantage of also being tolerant of wet soils. So this is how we measure it. You can see on the bottom 3 columns, basically you have the x-axis is turgor loss point, and you have well watered on the y-axis and water deficit. You can see that the bottom one, which was well watered, the 3 bars, spring, midsummer, and late summer, they, again, you'd expect in late summer, you'd have more osmotic adjustment. But the one that had gone through cyclical dry downs showed that the one that late summer had really changed and actually become more drought tolerant because it had experienced those cyclical dry downs and was able to step it up so that it became more turgor loss. It had a lower turgor loss point. So this is kind of interesting to see if we can actually modify the way trees grow so that they are able to tolerate a greater stress. So after we've been looking at these, we were evaluating many of these trees, and also we're looking at the same issues with Brandon Miller's Karya's experiment. We were very interested in hickories, and we're doing some of that work with his trees as well. We then had to figure out, well, how are we going to propagate these trees? And because these are all clones, they're all unique genotypes, and so we spent a lot of years early before we started breeding to figure out how we could clonally propagate them. And this is just a quick view of basically we cut trees down to a few, maybe 4 or 5 inches to get to the juvenile part of the plant. We cover over the plants so they're etiolated as they grow out. And we treat the bases of the plant with IBA, shade them so they don't crisp up in the sun. And then after we take the shade off, and we add soil that's mixed to the cone surrounding those trees, and then we get, hopefully, rooted plants. And so there you can see the whole process. And here we have clonally propagated oaks at the end. And this was great. We're very happy. We published all about this. But in 1 year, we might get 4 plants, which is not very good if we're going to try to introduce this to the nursery. So we went a different route. Tissue culture. Now, if anybody's familiar with micropropagation, oaks have never been really successfully propagated through tissue culture. And we have been working on this now for many years. And we've had some success. It's all genotypic specific. So what one works for one doesn't necessarily work for the other, but we have our certain trees. And here's the one tree we hope to introduce first, which is fondly called 1819. But this is a three-way cross of different white oaks. And we are starting to get this to multiply and to root in tissue culture. So we have hopes that we'll be introducing some of our hybrids that have particularly good characteristics in the next few years. So we had our first group of plants. We got so big we had to get them out of the ground. So we gave them to about 100 different communities in New York State, and each community got at least 5 trees, and they are very happy and the trees are growing well. And we're taking data on this in a long-term study to see how these trees are doing in different soils and different climates. We have trees in Lowville and Zone 3 down to Long Island in the tropics. So we have trees all over New York State that are of these hybrids that are being tested on a more observational long-term basis. So I'm going to change gears here just to talk about, we can look at plant selection, which is very important, and we can get better plants, more drought-tolerant plants, and so on. But everything really resides with the soil. You can have the best plant in the world, but with poor soil conditions, they really will not tolerate that condition very well, and they won't grow as well. So we had to deal with soil and soil disturbance in the urban environment. So this is just going to talk about our work with structural soil over the past 20 years. And this is we developed structural soil because of the required compaction prior to laying pavement. Pavement is ubiquitous in the urban environment, parking lots, sidewalks, roads. And in order to lay any pavement, you have to purposely compact the soil so you have a load-bearing surface to be able to lay the pavement. If it's too soft, the pavement will subside, it will crack. So you need load bearing. And I worked with engineers to figure out what they needed for this. And we learned to speak engineering during this process. So this is the kind of soil which engineers love to put pavement on. Very dense, brick-like. It's not going to subside. And of course, tree roots have a really hard time navigating this kind of soil. So here you see basically the compaction of the subgrade and the base course, the gravel mix, and then some reinforcement. And in the bottom of the screen, there's a square, which is where the tree is going to go. And the tree did go. And so the soil under that area was not treated any differently than the soil where the pavement is going to go. So yes, you can dig it out and you can put a tree there. And then the problem is, where does the tree roots go? I mean, they really have no place to go in terms of, because of the compaction level of that sidewalk base. And so we often say we lower the tree into the coffin here, which is unfortunate. Here's a 4x5 tree pit in New York City. Tree is going in, you're going to put some soil around it, and then the tree will grow or not grow. And typically it doesn't grow very well. So the idea was to come up with a way to meet the engineer specifications for load bearing of a sidewalk or asphalt or whatever, but still have a soil underneath that which could allow roots to penetrate and to grow. And this was a difficult combination of features to do, but we did develop something called structural soil. And you can see in this diagram, the white irregular shapes represent gravel of one size, like 1.5 size diameter. And if you get one size gravel and you basically compact it, you'll have very large pores or voids in between that. And so in the voids, we would put soil, and the soil, if we have stones touching stones, the soil in the pores or the voids is not compacted because the stone is bearing the load from on the top. You can think about it as a rigid lattice or a matrix, so that the stone provides this matrix, and then the soil is in the pores, and the soil is not compacted because it does not feel the compactive load on top. That's in this part of New York State, we use limestone as our base, typical cheap stone, and this is the size stone we would use for structural soil. And then we would add soil. It's about 80% stone, 20% heavy clay, loam, or at least 20% clay by weight. And this is how it's mixed. There's a couple of other features in that, but this has been used now many places. When we were basically exploring this, we needed to have some sidewalks to nowhere where we could put this in, because cities don't like you digging up all their sidewalks. So we actually developed this sidewalks to nowhere. We had structural soil and just compacted base mixed with not structural soil, and we had a clonal tree planted on top of them so we could look at what's going on with the roots. And then we take them apart, and that was about 4 or 5 years later. We take the sidewalk off. You see a little base course of gravel. Tree was cut down. And then we wanted to look at where the root growth was. So this is using that air spade again, the air excavation tool. And we could take the roots out in one piece by using the air spade. And that's a root system of a tree growing in structural soil, CU structural soil now. And we'd made these trenches down a meter deep, and so we could see just how extensive those roots were. And the control was here, our typical compacted soil with a little bit of base on top. And we excavated that as well. And that's what we found, which we find all over the place, these pancake-like roots with very shallow root systems. That one on the right just found its way down the edge of the trench, so otherwise it would not have been so deep. But pancake roots, very shallow, very susceptible to drought, is what we typically find. So we wanted to study roots under pavement, and this was a difficult thing. You'd have to go through what we did, taking the sidewalk off, air excavation. So is there an easier way to do this? So we started working with Gary Raffel, who's an arborist who owns a ground penetrating radar apparatus, which you're looking at here. It's like a souped up tricycle with a radar unit at the bottom. And we wanted to look at, well, here basically, there's been some new work with radar looking at how radar could not just look at stones and pot shards and metal, but it could actually locate roots. And we were very interested in this. And so you basically run the machine over the ground, and the radar will reflect a beam from roots. Roots are typically tubes of water. So this is the work that was done, was very interesting to us. So we could do this remotely, not having to dig up everything to see where the roots were. You can do it over pavement, you can do it over soil, and you get a virtual trench. On the right side of the slide, you see if you're walking along and you have depth, and you can, every one of those X's is a root detection. So we were very interested, started working with this, but before we got to the point where we could say, yes, this works, we're really locating roots, we had to do a ground truth study to see just where the roots were. Was it really accurate? So we took our sidewalks to nowhere, and we had our machine, and we did scans down on top of the sidewalk to look where the roots were. And of course, these were trenches. They were lined with heavy mill plastic, so we didn't expect them, and the roots did not go out into beyond the sidewalk area. And then we actually dug up some and had our own manual count, visual count of roots that were in that sidewalk area. We could only detect roots that just under a centimeter diameter. We couldn't get the fine roots, but we did do those counts. And interestingly, you see on the x-axis the CU radar signal count. That's what it was predicted. And on the y-axis is what we actually counted, which is just under a centimeter diameter roots. And it was pretty good. I mean, we're getting pretty good agreement between the radar and the visual actual, what are the roots looking like. So we're feeling confident with this. We could go into other areas to look at roots under pavement. So here's structural soil as we would actually specify it under sidewalks. And there's many sidewalks in Ithaca that look like this, where you have structural soil from 24 to 36 inches deep. And then where you have the tree, you have ordinary soil with the opening, but just putting structural soil under the pavement. And this has been done, there's actually 1,500 installations of this all over North America. This is in Brooklyn after 12 years. Here are the structural soil at the top left going in, not just in those pits, but continuously in a trench. You just see the openings there. And then after 3 years and after 12 years, those trees doing exceptionally well. Here in Ithaca, on State Street, you have elms planted and growing exceptionally well in structural soil there. And even in the Olympic site in Sydney, where when the Olympics were there, I was talking about this in San Francisco one year, and the developers of the Olympics were there, and they said, oh, let's try it there. So I didn't know anything about this, but they used structural soil for the big plaza where all the athletes would gather. And those are oriental plane trees growing in structural soil. And in Miami Beach, sure, palms and structural soil, well, why not? The roots get, depending how you design the structural soil, the roots can actually go for a much wider area and having a greater structural integrity. So the roots actually don't, trees don't blow over in storms, which they get very often there. But we were started to look at a combination of things using porous pavements and structural soil. More and more pavement gives rise to flooding downstream. We see this was actually Route 81 a few years ago. And we thought we could combine structural soil with porous asphalt to get trees to grow, to basically have water going back in the ground and trees growing in paved sites. We could do this because the porosity of structural soil. So the total porosity after compaction, okay, this 95 to 100% Proctor is an engineering term for compactive effort, a standard compactive effort. You would need to lay pavement on top of it. So structural soil, you have 26% porosity because you've got such big stones. And soil alone, you've got more porosity, 34%. But the macropores in structural soil after compaction, about 31% macropores. And in soil alone, you've got about 2% macropores. So the infiltration rate of structural soil is greater than 24 inches an hour, or be less than ½ an inch an hour on normal soil that's just been compacted. So we thought, well, okay, if we have the structural soil, we can put it under porous asphalt, we can get infiltration right through the profile into the groundwater. So this was a parking lot, a pull-off next to the trail near the inlet that the city wanted to improve. And they allowed us to make this a trial parking lot with structural soil and porous and non-porous asphalt. So we took the entire parking lot and put about 30 inches of structural soil and compacted it. And then we put half of it in porous asphalt and half in traditional non-porous asphalt. You can see the difference in porous and non-porous asphalt. So then in November 2005, we saw cut into the porous and non-porous asphalt, and there was structural soil, and we bare root planted elm trees in this parking lot. My students, of course, did it. Here it is the first year, that first spring of 2006. Trees were small, growing. We put them in small. You notice the big yellow barriers because this was 1.5-inch caliper trees, and I could see the snowplows just taking them out. So I put the barriers there. But this is after about another 4 years. They're growing well. And 2012, still well. They're shading this parking lot now. And here is last October, doing quite well. So we wanted to see what was going on with the roots. And we were noticing that in the non-porous side, the trees were somewhat smaller than the porous side. Now they all had structural soil, but there was porous and non-porous asphalt on top. Notice the trees on the right are somewhat bigger. So we did some work. We looked at tree growth for 6 years, and the black bars represent those trees in non-porous asphalt, with the gray bars are the porous asphalt. And you see the years, and over time, from 2012 to 2018, we're getting less and less growth. This is shoot growth in the non-porous asphalt paving. But in the porous asphalt, we were basically no change. It was growing 15 to 20 inches every year. So what's going on with the roots? So again, we took our ground penetrating radar and we were looking at what's happening with root growth, feeling confident that because we did our ground truth study, we could actually be optimistic that we were seeing the real roots underground without having to take everything up and destroy it. So there's, you see 3 and 4, those are trees in non-porous asphalt, and there are 6 scans on either side, which are the scans of the ground penetrating radar. And on the right side, there's trees 8 and 9, which are in structural soil, but in porous asphalt, and another 6 scans of ground penetrating radar. So this is what we saw. Each of these panels really is like a scan from about 5 inches down to 35 inches and along 35 feet area. And so each one of these red dots is a root that we found. And this was basically, this is on the non-porous asphalt. So the roots were, didn't go down as far as we might hope, but they were there, and this is where we looked at it. When we looked at porous asphalt, this was the root signal we got under the other trees. So we were getting roots way down deep, a lot more roots it seemed, and this was encouraging in terms of getting more water into those trees. Another way of looking at it is if you pancake the roots right to the surface, not looking at depth. This is a color root density chart where you can say where you have bluer colors, green colors are very few roots. Where you get to the orange and brown, you have a lot of roots. So this is the root scan of non-porous traditional asphalt. This is the roots if you pancake them right to the surface. And this is the root density of roots under porous asphalt. So a lot more roots, just as we saw with the scans, but a considerable number more roots. So, and if we look at it from basically looking at where the roots were in the porous asphalt, which is the gray bars, you had more at the surface, 8 inches, and basically about the same non-porous to porous asphalt, the roots in the middle, but where you really have a tremendous difference is the roots go down deep in under porous asphalt, and that's where you had the greatest increase of root growth. In total, you see you have quite a bit more root growth in porous versus non-porous asphalt. So I'm getting to the end, and I basically want to reiterate that there's the issues of tree selection and soil modification, soil remediation are the key factors to getting a success of trees so they can give us the ecosystem benefits. What you're looking at here is a plaza in New York City called Zuccotti Park. And these trees are growing all in structural soil underneath that concrete. The trees, on the other hand, are really good trees for urban environments. They're the honey locust. Oh, I would like to see more diversity. The trees are doing well. People enjoy the park. It's a success of soil and tree selection together. Because although we like structural soil, it has good attributes for underpavement, there's a compromise in that the available water holding capacity of this very stony mix is between 8 and 10%, which is low. So we have to choose trees that are more drought tolerant, that be able to mine for for water within this structural soil profile. So with that, I will allow some questions if there are any, and that's my website where there's lots of information about all the different projects we're doing, outreach, research, videos. Please feel free to enjoy that website.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Nina, very much for that comprehensive look at all the work that you've done in enhancing the urban environment. Now is a great time for questions. So if you have any questions, we can go ahead and get started with that. I don't see anything in the chat. Feel free to write them there or just chime in.
I have a question. Very nice presentation, Dr. Bassuk. I have a question about the pancake type roots that you talked about. Do you see a lot of wind damage to the trees where they fall down because of the roots being in the top layer, or compared to the ones?
Yes, in fact, people do ask me that aren't trees in structural soil more apt to fall over? I think, in fact, that's not the case because trees in structural soils go down deep and they go very wide. So you can think of a tree with two arms out, tree trunk with two arms going out. The more superficial the roots are, the more susceptible they are to wind throw and wind damage. And you see this lots in the, after a hurricane or after wind damage, you'll see the very pancake-like nature, even in forested areas where roots may need to be in the surface area because of denser layers below. So in fact, in structural soil, we can get roots down deep, which is going to be hopefully better for reducing that wind throw problem.
Brandon, I have a question.
Yes.
Hey, Nina, really enjoyed your seminar.
Thank you.
Just wondering, are there stress-tolerant rootstocks available? Are they rarely used? Or, you know, I can see that stress-tolerant rootstocks can definitely play into this.
Well, there are obviously, and you know, apples, cherries, there are the fruit crops, there are rootstocks that are clonal and give different attributes, but with the, basically with all these ornamental plants, typically the clonal scion is grafted onto a seedling.
Seedlings, okay.
Yeah, so there are very few, there's a couple in the crabapple field where they're basically rootstocks that don't sucker. Those are clonal, but most of these trees are grafted or budded onto a seedling.
Okay.
That would be nice to see if we can get that too, but that has not been done.
All right. Well,
Hi, Nina.
See anything in the chat?
Thank you so much for the great talk. I had a question about, should I type it in the chat? Can you hear me?
No, please go
I
ahead.
can hear you, I can hear you.
Great. I had a question if you think that like using the structural soil as a remediation method would be possible for reducing some of the drastic seeing in a lot of cities, especially as like sea levels rise, if that could be a method to kind of delay like green space to capture that runoff water.
Well, we do use structural soil as like a bioswale because it has so much porosity. Even when compacted, it has basically 25% porosity. So you can use it as in a bioswale. I'm not sure about seawater. We'd have to deal with salt, but for flooding, it can be a reservoir under the soil to actually capture considerable amount of water because the infiltration rate is so fast that it captures that as long as the surface is porous, so that it will capture it and then allow it to go into the groundwater over time. So this is used in bioswales, just typically just gravel under bioswales, but using structural soil, you could have roots grow down deeper to actually use the water that's down there. If I answer your question, I'm not sure about seawater. That's a whole nother ball of wax in terms of tree tolerance of seawater.
Awesome, thank you.
You're welcome.
Nina, can you comment on tree planting along stream sides, specifically Cayuga Inlet?
Well, for the last 10 years, my class has been planting along Cayuga Inlet. The Ithaca Garden Club has a project where they're planting crab apples along the inlet. And typically it's my class every fall that plants 15 or 20 of them. Is there another issue in terms of what comment about the inlet? It's channelized. It's not kind of a gradual edge. You know, it was the Army Corps of Engineers who developed the inlet to prevent flooding. And so there are many trees now going in. Other than that, I'm not sure if there's another question there.
Perhaps if they can clarify if they're looking for something else. There is another question in the chat. Have you done any work with herbaceous plants, annual plants in the structural soil, and also grasses?
I've grown shrubs in it, woody plants, but I haven't grown herbaceous plants. I would expect that many of the more drought-tolerant grasses especially would do really well in structural soil. I mean, again, all of these plants, no matter what, herbaceous or woody, would have to become established first before you let them go. Because when you transplant something, the roots have been compromised, they've been restricted, and now you have to let those roots grow before the plant takes on the attributes of which you planted. So I would imagine, though I've never tried it, that herbaceous plants will do well. On the other hand, why would you want to do that? Structural soil was only engineered to be under pavement. And that's the reason to do it. If you don't need to use that load-bearing soil, don't do it. There's other ways of remediating soil that where you don't have to put the load-bearing for pavement. We're just talking about load-bearing for pavement when we talk about structural soil.
Is there a significant additional cost using structural soil?
Well, structural soil is pretty cheap considering it's just heavy clay, loam soil and gravel with a little bit of hydrogel sprinkled on the, so anyway, basically it's somewhere in the range about $50 a cubic yard. The real cost is the excavation. So if you're dealing with a new streetscape and you want to put structural soil in, you have to excavate. You can't just, you know, basically rough up the first 6 inches and put a tree in. You have to give it at least 24, preferably near the 36-inch depth to be able to have enough volume of soil and water to support that tree. Where people have done 10 or inches of structural soil, I said, you know, save your money. Don't do that because there's not enough depth. So the real cost is the excavation. If it's new construction where that's not an issue because it's already part of the deal, then the real cost is pretty minimal considering the other costs of building. So that's where that stands.
We have a clarification for the question about the inlet.
Okay.
So the Cayuga Inlet has poor water quality because it's channelized. How can tree plantings help improve water quality in the channel?
I don't know if they can. The trees that are planted on the inlet are, you know, quite a ways away from the edge. I mean, unless you're trying to get roots into the water to take up sediments. I mean, the roots of the trees on the banks will hold that bank, but I don't see, in my experience, a lot of erosion into the water. There probably is the sedimentation is coming from upstream, I would imagine, but where we've planted right downtown in Ithaca, it doesn't appear that there's much erosion from those banks. And to that extent, the trees will help that. Other than that, I would have to do more exploration to see where the poor water quality was coming from.
I don't see any other questions right now. So thank you, Dr. Bassuk, for your fantastic presentation.
Thank you, Brandon, and thank you, everybody, for listening.
Absolutely.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.